June 12, 1944, Honolulu, Oahu. The noon light is white-hot, a blade pressed flat across the gulch. Dust rasps in every breath. Cicadas grind like worn bearings. At the women's fence, Nakamura Keiko waits with a stitched handkerchief folded into a square, coupons tucked beneath. She has learned the rhythm here. The canteen shutter sticks, the corporal curses once, twice, then the wood jumps and the line begins to creep. Up in the watchtower, Sergeant William Red Iverson of the 372 Infantry Count's hats reads posture and feels the day trying to come apart under the heat. The rumour has moved faster than the wind. A morning truck from the harbour. Crates stencilled in English script none of them can read, but all can recognise now. Coca-Cola. The corporal drags one forward and the crate clinks like a bag of little bells. Keiko can see the bottles through the slats, green glass caught by the sun. The kerosene icebox sweats on its metal feet. The generator beyond the fence keeps a 60-cycle bass thrum that settles into bone. Her turn comes with the brusque nod enlisted men everywhere use when the rulebook allows kindness. She passes coupons, receives a bottle beaded with cold, and startles when the cap tool bites. The hiss is small, almost intimate, but it carries. She has been taught that sweetness is childish, luxury a moral weakness. Wartime Japan measured virtue in ration tickets and silence. The first sip is so cold it feels like a mistake. The second is understanding. Not charity, she thinks, system. Iverson watches the line move, watches the shoulders lower, the talk loosen. He hears a private on the tower catwalk, a Georgia boy, whistle a blues fragment that wanders in and out of tune, and he lets it pass. Order is not only barbed wire and towers. Order, he's learning, is also a cap that pops the same way every time, a crate that stacks without wobble, a price that never changes, 5 cents whether you're in Kansas or in Hell Valley. Keiko wipes her wrist where condensation has run in a chill ribbon and darkened the dust. She would have saved the bottle if rules allowed. She settles for memorizing the shape of the glass, the curving waist, the heavy lip. Around her the heat remains, the gulch does not forgive, but something in the air has shifted its weight. She thinks very carefully that a nation able to spare cold sweetness for its prisoners must be building other, harder mercies by the shipload. When the shutter thumps closed for the midday count, the last bead of water falls from her bottle to the cinders and hisses like rain that has forgotten how to be rain. Before dawn, near Honolulu Harbour, the bottling floor glows the colour of a low fire. Mary Ellen Duval chalks a column of numbers on a slate and taps the ammonia gauge with a knuckle until the needle stops trembling. The plant breathes in rhythms a machinist would recognise. Rinser arms wheeze, fill heads kiss glass, crowners descend with a standardised bite that crimps the cap in 21 teeth. Each sound is a promise that somewhere downrange a cap will hiss and somebody's day will change. She walks the line once more, clipboard pressed flat to her coveralls. Syrup at 1 part to 5 parts treated water, temperature held just so, pressure at 50 pounds per square inch, not 49 and not 51, because 50 makes the bubbles tight and honest. The spare parts bin shows its orderly poverty. Belts stacked like black crescents, gaskets curled in wax paper, thermometer stems bound with cotton string. The quartermaster has taught her that logistics is the art of never being surprised, and she respects that art the way gunners respect recoil. A reefer trailer idles in the yard, generator coughing into steadiness. The driver checks his watch against hers. Schedules nest like Russian dolls. Ship to dock, dock to plant, plant to gulch. Pallets are uniform, crates uniform, glass uniform, even the hand signals are uniform. She has seen a deck gang unload artillery fuses with less ceremony than the way these bottles pass from gloved hand to gloved hand. She suspects, not without pride, that the enemy misunderstands what kind of weapon this is. Out on the street, Honolulu yawns awake. blackout curtains shading windows, stevedores shouldering into daylight, a truck of army nurses laughing at something only they heard. Duval signs the manifest in triplicate and thumbs the carbon paper until the corners line up. Somewhere uptown, a PX clerk will ring the same nickel he rang yesterday and tomorrow, because the price is part of the message. The United States does not haggle with itself. The plant's cold breath follows the truck as it grinds into gear. If the compressor were to falter, she would have a plan. If a gasket wept, there's a drawer labelled with its exact diameter. If the bottle washer hiccuped, 3 wrenches hang in reach by size and ghosted outlines. She listens to the departing clatter and thinks about distance. 16 miles of road, maybe, and then a canyon of heat. A long chain for a short sound. She pauses at the doorway and pockets a spare crown cap, a habit she cannot justify except as a talisman. 21 teeth, always the same bite. In a world where fortunes lurch and ships vanish into weather, a cap that behaves is a small republic of its own. She turns off the floor lights row by row, leaving the hum to keep company with the gauges. Afternoon glare lays a hard edge on everything that casts a shadow. Iverson walks the perimeter with a grease pencil tucked behind his ear, ticking off towers, checking the overlap of fields of fire, listening to the camp as if it were a machine that could develop a rattle. The loudspeaker coughs, then announces mess times with the crisp weariness of someone who has said the same thing 1,000 times. Beyond the wire, the gulch breathes heat. Inside, the mess halls stage a punctual miracle, serving thousands by design, not luck. Keiko folds a small English lesson into her apron pocket and joins an orderly line that would have made any headmistress proud. She would have seen ration cards in Sasebo punched until the paper sagged. Here, coupon booklets are neat as banknotes and traded with the calm arithmetic of a payroll office. The canteen ledger keeps columns for soda, soap, razor blades, stationery, an economy in miniature, supervised by a corporal who knows he is operating policy, not whim. She would have noticed the tense guy ropes tuned like strings, the watchtower's ladders polished by hands. Sato watches from a measured distance, the way an officer watches his men at rest, alert for slackness, for softness that might grow into rot. He tries not to notice laughter stepping between languages as if they were stones across a creek. He studies the watchtowers instead. Pyramidal roofs, ladder rungs shining, the guard's shadow a black triangle leaning across the dust. He cannot decide whether the comfort distributed here is a trap or a doctrine. He writes nothing. The notebook stays in his pocket like an unspent round. The impossible fact arrives sideways, almost a joke. A quartermaster visiting from the docks tells Iverson that cap waste, miscrimps and floor drops from the Honolulu line, just the waste, would weigh more metal in a month than some enemy garrisons likely saw in small arms ammunition for the same period. Iverson snorts, then does the math in his head and stops snorting. It is the kind of number that lives in supply rooms and never makes it to monuments. It would have sounded like boasting if it were not the calm truth of a busy plant. Keiko finishes her lesson, reading the label aloud, vowels careful, and tucks the bottle under her arm for the walk back. The glass leaves a cool oval against her dress that will pass in a minute, but seems for now like a promise kept. Behind her, the canteen closes its shutter with a sound like a hatch dogged shut at sea, a neat clack that says, "Tomorrow again." Evening slides down the gulch like a shade being drawn, and with it the day's anger cools to something like thought. Sato sits cross-legged on a cot that gives a little tired sigh under his weight and opens the notebook he keeps stitched into the lining of his blanket. He has borrowed a pencil nub from a hospital orderly and shaved it with a mess knife until the point looks surgical. There is no poetry in the first line he writes. Numbers, then units, then comparisons, the way gunnery tables would have trained a careful mind to see. He begins with what he can see and what he can ask without inviting trouble. 24 bottles per crate, 5 crates per dolly, 2 dollies per truck run to the canteen, 2 runs before noon, another in the afternoon if the road holds and the plant hits its quota. He notes the ice deliveries by the way men carry themselves, fast when cold, slow when the bins run low, and estimates melt by the frequency of mop buckets. He turns this into sugar weight, fuel consumption, crankshaft hours. He feels foolish and then does not. He allows himself a memory that would have been punished in the fleet, the brief, illicit satisfaction of a cold drink in Sasebo in 1937, a bottle shared among 4 men on a payday, the cap bent off with a bayonet, the taste more duty than pleasure. He writes that memory down next to today's arithmetic and draws a small line between them like a horizon. It is the line a mind crosses when it admits that the enemy is not lucky, only prepared. Voices stall outside the tent and move on. He writes faster. The generators do not stutter. The schedules do not apologize. He has been told all his life that indulgence weakens men. He can feel a different truth taking root, quiet and humiliating. Standardization, correctly used, strengthens even the moment of indulgence. This is not softness. It is power expressed as temperature and timing. He hears a cap hiss in the distance and imagines a firing pin dropping cleanly, a breech locking without complaint. The sounds share a grammar. He closes the notebook and presses his palm to the cover until the sweat leaves a print. He would have preferred a clearer enemy, one that broke where you struck it and stayed broken. Lights go out in order, 1, 2, 3, as if obeying a drill. The gulch holds the day's heat like a banked stove. Sato breathes and tries the dignity of admitting that the doctrine he served may have misunderstood this war. Comfort is not the aim. It is the signal that the machine behind it cannot be stopped. He lies back, forearm across his eyes, and listens to the generator's steady tone until numbers begin to march in it, little platoons of certainty drilling all night. Morning fog lifts off the harbour like breath and the winches start their music. A Liberty ship throws open its hatches. Slings rise and fall in a choreography that started in a Pittsburgh mill and will end in a canteen window on a hot strip of ground called Hell Valley. Duval walks beside a quartermaster sergeant who carries his clipboard with the gravity of a chaplain with a Bible. They speak in short, exact phrases because on the docks everything that isn't precise becomes heavy and liable to fall. The compressor crate arrives with stencils sharp enough to cut your finger, model numbers, serials, a destination code that tells anyone who can read it exactly how many miles of road and wire sit between the harbour and the gulch. Duval signs for gaskets like an ordnance officer signs for fuse setters. She checks the spare parts kit, belts, seals, gauges, a crown capper spring she could install blindfolded. The reefer trailer coughs itself into a steady idle. The driver spits, grins, and says they'll be early if the road behaves and late if it doesn't. On the pier next over, someone jokes that all this fuss for soda is ridiculous. The sergeant does not smile. He has a numbers story he tells when men get flip. The United States runs 64 overseas bottling plants, and production in the last quarter alone would fill a train long enough to make a colonel nervous about schedules. He doesn't mention the other trains, steel, penicillin, spare barrels, because the point is made. Abundance is the plan, not the byproduct. Out through the city, streetcars clatter, shore patrol waves a truck through, a cluster of Marines shoulders past like a small weather system. The reefer's generator harmonizes with the truck's engine until the sound becomes background, the way heartbeat becomes unnoticed until it falters. Duval rides shotgun because the road has opinions and likes to share them. She keeps a hand on the clipboard and another on the dash when the washboard starts. Pallets and people survive by bracing at the right moment. The gulch opens like a mouth sulking in afternoon light. The guard checks the manifest as if it were a letter from home, then waves them in. Duval watches the first crate lift, the first bottle taken, the first hiss swallowed by heat. She would have liked to stand there and count caps for the satisfaction of it, but the schedule is a jealous officer, and the reefers don't load themselves. She thinks, not for the first time, that an enemy taught to worship scarcity will never recognize this convoy for what it is, a sermon preached in pallets and BTUS. They turned the mess tent into a classroom by pinning maps to the canvas and setting a coffee urn on a crate like an altar. Iverson sat on a folding chair while a logistics officer from the harbour tapped a pointer against a chart as if calling cadence. The wind toyed with the corners, paper cracked like small flags. Numbers arrived the way orders do, calm, final, and without room for argument. The officer began with the obvious made astonishing: canteens in every camp by policy, coupons in prisoner pockets by design, supply that arrived like weather and stayed. He cited the date, 22nd April 1942, when the rulebook made canteens mandatory, then moved to the arithmetic of reach. Hundreds of sites across the nation holding roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners, each a small market fed on schedule. Coupons earned by labour became purchases. Purchases became stories sent home through censored mail that still let morale leak like light under a door. Then came the slide that made men whistle. More than 5 billion bottles delivered to troops and occupation forces during and after the war. 64 bottling plants in theatre. Honolulu's capper could run 10,000 crowns in a shift if the compressor behaved. Multiplied across the network, the United States could pop enough caps in a single day to outnumber the enemy's annual soft drink production by a margin that would have sounded like propaganda before 1941. Someone laughed, then stopped because the number refused to be funny. Iverson pictured crowners rising and falling from Bougainville to Belfast, a percussion section in a continental orchestra that also played steel, wheat and aviation gasoline. He thought of his tower, a ladder polished by hands, a field of fire calculated in degrees, a duty roster written in pencil. He drafted a line to his mother in his head: "We popped enough caps today to weigh like a destroyer's ready ammo," and decided not to write it. It would read like bragging. Let the facts do the work. From outside the tent, Sato caught the cadence, if not the content. He watched the officer's hand chop the air into increments and felt the same dull heat behind the eyes that came with a perfectly plotted artillery correction. Indulgence, he realized, had been made to march like infantry. Comfort kept time. The briefing closed with throughputs, mess halls that fed thousands per seating twice daily, generators with fuel set aside in neat ratios, reefer trailers scheduled like gun trucks. If there was a shortage, it would be temporary by design. The system hated surprise and punished improvisation only when it was sloppy. Chairs scraped. The urn sloshed. Iverson stepped into sunlight, already thinning toward evening, and found his tower by habit. Inside the tent, the charts lifted and settled, little breaths that would not stop until the war did. The alarm was not loud, just wrong, a cough in the compressor's breath that made the gauges twitch like spooked horses. Duval was moving before the mechanic could find his cap, crossing the concrete in 3 strides, palm on the crankcase as if it were a fevered brow. Pressure sagged from 50 to 47 psi, then to 46. In a gulch, this hot, that drop would travel down the chain into flat bottles, then into a day's morale. She had a wrench in her hand by the time the mechanic said her name. Valves quarter turn, then 1/8 turn, easing the ammonia's route through the evaporator like a traffic sergeant pushing cars through an intersection after a wreck. She cracked the purge, tasted the sharp cold on the air, and listened for the note she trusted, the baritone hum that meant the cold was honest again. The spare gauge had been requisitioned 2 weeks back and sat that moment in a Navy storeroom with a forms problem. She had cannibalized a unit meant for shipboard repairs and logged the sin in a neat hand that would satisfy anyone up the chain who cared. Belts looked good, teeth on the crown machine still crisp. The rinser's arm had a hitch she noted for evening maintenance. She kept the line at speed, no heroics, with her ear tuned to the small choices machinery makes when it thinks no one is watching. Outside, reefers idled like patient cattle. The driver who called her mum, even though her coveralls smelled like solvent, leaned in to ask if they'd missed the second run. Not if the road behaved, she said. Not if the right hand on the shifter trusted the hill and the left hand kept the clipboard square to the wind. The plant's clock said they could still feed the canteen before the worst of the afternoon, and that mattered as much as any fire mission or ration line. It was not charity to keep time, it was doctrine disguised as courtesy. By noon the gauge needle steadied at an honest 50 again and stayed there, the way a competent non-com holds formation without making a speech about it. She walked the floor once more, laying the back of her fingers against coolant pipes, feeling the world that the enemy rarely imagined when they thought of American power. Men fear guns, machines fear neglect. The trick was to let neither get much of what they feared. On the yard, sun wrote hard shadows under the truck. Duval checked her slate, chalk dust on her palm, and nodded the run out the gate. The capper lifted, bit, and released, 21 perfect teeth, thousands of times with the tranquil cruelty of a metronome. Somewhere down gulch a prisoner would hear that hiss and think it mercy. She knew better. It was an order, fulfilled on time. The light went gold in the hour when even hard men forgive a little. Sato waited for the lieutenant with his hat in his hand, not as a gesture, but as a device. Surrender makes some questions easier to hear. The guard brought them within hearing distance of the wire and stepped back just far enough to be polite, hands down, thumbs hooked, the posture of a man who can end a conversation if it goes wrong. Sato cleared his throat and asked, in English that had grown less proud since the gulch, why a nation would spend fuel and glass and cold on enemies held behind barbed wire. The lieutenant, young, sunburned, a pencil in his pocket where a ribbon could have sat, took the question without performance. Because we can, he said first, which sounded like arrogance until he added the second part. Because what you write home about this place helps end the war faster than bullets alone. He pointed, not with his finger, never with the finger of a man in charge, to the canteen and to the censor stamp on the mailbag a private lugged past. The stamp did not delete kindness, it only trimmed its edges. He said the policy dates, Iverson had heard them too, canteens by regulation from 1942, coupons by design, so that every bottle represented a concession earned, not begged. He said abundance convinces without argument. Sato listened as if to whether he had to fight a ship through. He had been taught that mercy is weakness in disguise. He could feel the opposite here, a strength so large it had to spend itself to be believed. He thought of the way a breech locked, the way a drill moved men until their bodies made right angles with the ground. This was that, but sweet. He asked about the caps, their bite so uniform. The lieutenant told him 21 teeth and a tolerance a machinist would be proud to summarize at a bar. Uniform teeth, uniform taste, uniform message. Keiko had come close enough to hear the cadences, if not every word. She caught enough to understand that the bottle in her hand was a kind of letter drafted in steel and syrup, posted through a system that did not lose mail. The guard shifted, checked his watch, and drew the conversation to its regulation end with a polite, "That's time, sir," which in any language means there is still a clock and it still rules the living. When they broke away, the lieutenant touched the brim of his cap, and Sato answered with the bow of a man whose conclusions have changed by a degree that will widen into miles. The wire held the light for a second, a long silver line, and then the gulch took the colour back and stored it for morning. Night softened the gulch without forgiving it. The generator hummed with the patience of a good sergeant, and kerosene lamps pooled small islands of yellow where men compared blisters and rumours. Iverson walked the perimeter with his flashlight tight against his chest, beam low, posture easy. He broke up a scuffle over coupons with the tired authority of a man who knows fights start when the day runs long. He distributed the pages back to their owners and made them read the names aloud like a schoolmaster calling roll. Then, because he could, because he had learned that in this place kindness worked like a wrench, he bought one bottle out of his pocket and pressed it into the sicker man's hand. Keiko moved like a purposeful shadow between tents and the infirmary, bartering stitchwork for coupons and returning with soda and canned peaches that she placed on the shelf with a librarian's pride. She kept lists, tidy columns that would have pleased her headmaster back home, who contributed, who needed, who promised to return a favour and actually did. In the quiet arithmetic of the night, the gulch felt briefly manageable, a ledger that could be balanced if everyone kept a pencil sharp. The numbers that would have sounded like mythology 3 years earlier threaded through the calm. The overseas bottling network could, in a single high month, likely crown enough bottles to hand every US service member multiple cold drinks a week, an output that measured only in cap metal would stack into a ribbon long enough to bridge harbours in a line of glittering teeth. Back of the envelope, men said, grinning at their own audacity, and yet the envelopes kept proving right. A system that could waste caps and still not notice the loss was a system that would not come apart under fire. Sato sat on a bunk and felt the fever in the man on the next mattress loosen its hold after 3 slow swallows. The sound the bottle made when it came away from the lips, small, respectful, felt like a ritual word. He told himself that the relief was chemical, sugar in blood, cold against heat. He told himself that gratitude is a dangerous habit. Then he thanked Keiko anyway, and the danger did not arrive. Iverson finished the loop, wrote up the scuffle without drama, and added a line in the margin about infirmary supplies that wasn't strictly in his remit. He clicked off the flashlight and stood a minute in the dark, listening to generators and the low human murmur that means a place will still be there when you return. Somewhere a cap hissed and a man laughed, the small sound you hear when weight slides off a chest by inches, not miracles. It was enough. Morning found a quiet table and made it important. Duval laid down her production sheet, numbers straight as fence pickets, and set a stub of pencil on top to keep the trade winds from walking the paper into the yard. Iverson placed his last letter home, folded but not sealed, its language careful where pride wanted to run. Sato produced his notebook with the formality of an officer submitting a report, and Keiko, to everyone's surprise, unfolded a page of lined paper that showed a clerk's neat hand, the infirmary ledger she kept without asking permission, columns in both languages exact as if printed. They did not compare to boast. They compared because all of them had begun to suspect that the truth of this place was a sum too large for one person to hold. Duval tapped throughput. Cases per hour across the crowners, breakage under 1% when the washers stayed honest, cap crimp failures nearly non-existent once the spring was replaced on schedule. Iverson added miles driven on the Gulch Road, fuel allotted, delays logged in pencils that could be erased but weren't. Keiko slid her page forward. Names, needs, returns, a small economy that made its own sense without the wire's permission. Sato, who had never been asked to share numbers except as proof of obedience, offered conversions, bottle counts to sugar weight, generator hours to coolant demand, and watched as his enemies nodded at his math. The impossible part was not any single figure. It was the way they nested. A crown cap's 21 teeth meant something to a machinist, and something else to a guard, and something immediate to a woman shepherding peaches toward fevers. Add the teeth to the cases to the miles, and you arrived without fanfare at reach. The kind that gets confused with luck until you put the ledgers side by side and see design. Wind worried the paper and laid it back down again. They spoke about the Kappa's maintenance schedule with the seriousness usually reserved for fire discipline. They spoke about coupon allotments with a rigour that belonged to payroll sergeants and quartermasters. They spoke about the way a bottle passes from plant to hand without losing temperature as a victory that does not fit on a ribbon. None of it made a statue, but all of it made the day work. When they rose, Duval slid her page into a folder that would go to a harbour office. Iverson folded his letter closed. Sato tied his notebook back into the blanket with fingers that did not tremble. Keiko smoothed her ledger and tucked it away as if shelving a book. The table was only wood, but the papers had made it a bridge between 4 different wars that turned out to be one. It is one thing to feel a bottle go cold against your palm, another to follow its shadow to the horizon. The story widened. Maps came down from the mess tent and then were drawn again in memory. A chain of dots that looked like constellations if you squinted and like warehouses if you didn't. Out in the territories and theatres, 64 bottling plants worked the same hymn. In the States, hundreds of camps held roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners, each with its own small market mandated by policy, each with coupons earning purchase, each with a schedule that punched like a time clock in heaven. Duval tried once to describe it to a cousin in a letter that never made it past the censor because it read like a factory brag. She wrote that throughput curves have a beauty, that breakage under 1% means owning not just the line, but the minute. She compared syrup tonnage moving through Honolulu to artillery propellant moving through depots inland, not to cheapen either, but to confess that the nation had learned to carry more than one kind of power at once. She used the phrase mean time to warm as a joke, and then, charmed by its perverse accuracy, kept it. Iverson had his own aerial view, built from 100 small corrections. A reefer broken on the hill was replaced by afternoon. A driver sick at noon was covered by a man in the yard who had already seen the road thrice this month and would see it again. He knew that the capacity to absorb error without shedding output is as decisive as a rifle that does not jam. He taught a private to read arrival tables the way you teach a recruit to read a horizon. Sato, hearing the figures, plants, prisoners, billions of bottles, understood that he had misnamed his enemy. He had said decadent when he meant disciplined, soft when he meant synchronized. The taste on his tongue no longer read as indulgence, it read as a proof. A system that could spare sweetness on schedule would not fail at bitter work. Keiko, whose ledger showed debt paid and kindness circulated in neat boxes, realized that what felt like charity was closer to scaffolding. It held until people could stand. The scale did not swell into boasting, it settled into the bones the way good training does. Trucks moved, caps bit. The gulch took its heat and gave it back at dusk. Somewhere, a plant 1,000 miles away struck the same chord at the same hour, gauges steady, belts true. If you had stacked a day's crates from all theatres rim to rim, you could have scribed a line across a map that no enemy could cross with sermons about sacrifice. The line would not be straight. It would be on time. Time jumped, because that is what time does after wars. 1946 in Tokyo smelled like coal dust and boiled cabbage and 100 small restitutions. Sato stood at a street stand where the enamel sign had survived the fires by some perverse grace and traded coins for a bottle the colour of remembered afternoons. The cap hissed with the same 21-tooth bite the Honolulu kroner had promised, and the memory that came was not humiliation but a cooling. He drank and said nothing. The city around him negotiated a new grammar for hunger and work. He understood now that the taste was not an insult but a sentence in that grammar. Keiko stepped into a classroom that returned her to herself, chalk squeaking on slate with the happy insolence of peacetime. 2 doors down, a fresh sign, script familiar now, hung over a counter where a boy in a cap wiped the same spot as if polishing were a rite. She would, gently, teach English words that included invoice and schedule. She would not apologize for the practicality. She had learned that civilization is a ledger kept upright by hands that refuse to shake. Iverson came home with a letter he never mailed in a drawer and a habit of checking street corners for angles that watchtowers teach. He told his children that the country was worth the work because he had seen it keep promises in places no one would ever put on a postcard. He did not talk about the scuffle or the bottle in the infirmary. He talked about a cap that hissed the same way in a gulch and in a city, and how that sameness meant law, not accident. Duval trained a replacement and walked the plant floor one last evening. Gauges steady, belts singing, the capper lifting and biting with a patience that outlived slogans. The war had ended, but the specification sheet had not. The world would be rebuilt on standards as much as on treaties. She kept the spare crown cap in her pocket until the brass wore friendly, then put it in a drawer beside photographs and a manifest with her handwriting straight enough to plumb a wall. The impossible fact lingered without needing a witness, that a democracy, having learned to make comfort on time, kept that habit and thereby kept peace on time too. The aftertaste was not only sweet, it carried a bite of iron, of rails, of rules. In the gulch, long since emptied, rain found its way back down old paths. If you leaned and listened, you might, for a second, hear the ghost of a generator under the cicadas. It would sound like a country deciding again to